everybody. Oh, uh-oh.
Shut down.
In the meantime, what games are y'all playing? I'm serious about this. It's Fortnite again. Yes, this is the second time I've heard that today. Cuphead? Cool. Have you gotten very far on it? I heard it's brutal.
Yeah, I beat the game.
Ah, congrats.
I was super stoked. I got all the achievements. So.
That's amazing. I've seen how hard that game is. I heard someone else yell something.
Overwatch.
Cool. I hear a lot of people playing Overwatch. Okay. Well, welcome. My name is Evva Kraikul. I am going to be talking a little bit today about this topic of digital games and emerging voices, coding as a creative practice. A little bit about myself. That's me on the top right-hand corner. Not my proudest moment. I thought my bangs were really cool. Just a tad bit about my background. I consider myself a social entrepreneur and specifically a UX designer who's serving as the executive director currently at Glitch. I started Glitch with my partner roughly around 2010, 2011. So it's been quite a bit of time, and it originally started as a student group. So when we were in college, at the time I was 18, 19, we kind of both realized that we really wanted to work in and or on games in some way, shape, or form. And unfortunately, there really weren't a ton of opportunities for us within the University of Minnesota. There weren't any researchers that were specifically discussing games or researching games in any sort of capacity, whether it was through programming or it was through psychology. And human-computer interaction was still very new, and that department hadn't even formed yet. No one was talking about it in design. And on a local perspective, there really weren't a ton of organizations that were bringing kind of the local leaders, such as Fantasy Flight and Game Informer, and a lot of the folks who existed within Minnesota together. There's a local IGDA group that met once a month on Wednesdays, but unfortunately it was just really hard to get, about 40 minutes away. So what we ended up doing was just making it. A little bit more on my background. I've been on a computer since I was 4 years old. The first game I ever played was something called Just My Grandma and Me. It was a part of the Little Critters Living Book series, and it was available on an Apple computer that was in my preschool. My parents were immigrants from Thailand, and they actually threw me into preschool pretty early because they were incredibly nervous that I wasn't going to be able to pick up English very quickly. And so I'm actually a year technically behind, or like a year ahead, excuse me. So I was always the youngest in my class by a lot. So like a good handful of the juniors were older than me when I was a senior in high school. So a little bit on my console side, I had a Super Nintendo for roughly about a week. My dad had bought it from a thrift store, and there were a couple of games that were included, specifically Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, and one of the Super Mario Brothers was on there. And I was apparently just spending a little bit too much time on that, and I honestly don't know what my dad was thinking when he said too much time, but he got rid of it after a week of me sitting on that console for a little too long. I started building websites and using AOL a lot, and also started building battle simulators in AOL chat rooms at roughly around 11, and mostly to play Pokemon. That was a lot of fun. And I also, when I was building websites, I built them because I really needed to sell and offload my Beanie Babies before the market crashed. Back to Glitch a little bit. After not finding, what myself and my partner really needed at our university, we ended up starting just a ton of different meetups for play and also to make. We started scheduling talks and conversations with professionals who were in the game space. So one of the first people we ever reached out to was a person named Mike Ambinder, who is an experimental psychologist at Valve. He didn't come out, but we specifically just put him on a monitor and said, like, hey, could you talk about your research? And at the time, he was really focused on trying to understand player behavior on the side of fear. How can they understand fear? And they were doing some really crazy things to me at the time. Was kind of like they were trying to test the pH of sweat that was coming off of players when they were playing like various games. But we started just doing those, and within the first 6 months, we started recognizing that there were ways that we could actually fund some of these programs, and so we had applied to a grant program at the university. And within that first 6 months, we actually received a $45,000 grant, and I was at the age of 19 at the time. And we essentially pitched a bunch of ideas, and they said yes to a ton of it. And we started building out really what is the starts and the beginning of kind of what I would consider the R&D for what the basis was for Glitch. And at this point, like 7 or 8 years later, I really worked with over hundreds of game makers at this point and organizations, specifically to develop and design games, design programming, and also launch national and international initiatives. Some more formal roles, even outside of Glitch. I've done business development with Activision Blizzard Media Networks, specifically working with a bunch of our partners through that, such as Riot and Blizzard, and at the time, Sony Online Interactive. I also consulted with Riot and their global publishing team not too long after that, and specifically targeted and focused on a lot of their viewing parties and their community building, such as university and college organizations. If you're familiar with like their collegiate program, I was actually pretty heavily involved with the design and development of that project. Some indie games that I love and I think are incredibly fun. On the bottom left-hand corner, you can see Clawbreaker. That was, I think, one of the first games that I had made. Yeah, one of the first games that I had made during a game jam. And that was made with a team of 6 people. We made it in 24 hours, and it's basically a claw-to-claw, aka head-to-head battle with another crab. It's you and another crab who's basically fighting for territory in this game. Games are really fast. On average, when we were measuring it through Unity Analytics, it was roughly around a 3-second match every time. So it was kind of like a pick up and go, and you could just basically go up to 100 matches within like 10 minutes or so. Space Canoe VR is on the top left-hand corner, another game jam game, specifically just exploring VR with a butt controller. We used a Wii Fit board and had people sit down in our canoe, and they not only used the Vive controllers, but also sat down and kind of like steered with their body. A couple of projects that are coming up next, Optico, which will be released on mobile within the next roughly 6 months here. A series of STEM games that we're partnering with PBS on mobile, and then also Dire Realm, which is a cooperative tabletop strategy game based on magic and rebellion and resistance. Should be coming out within the next 6 months as well. More broadly, a little bit about Glitch. What on earth is this thing that I keep talking about that is Glitch? We're a community-driven arts and education center, specifically for emerging game makers. We have ongoing programs and events, grants, and even artist residencies. And most importantly, at the core of everything that we do is we invest in the people who are behind all of the games. A little bit about the breakdown of our programs. We really have 2 core things that we do, which is our programming and our studio. On the left side here, yeah, your left side too. On the left side here, you can see that we have annual programming that focuses specifically on building out some of the fundamental skills on development. So learning about C#, learning about how to use SVN, learning a little bit about art and storyboarding, learning how to develop and or create a business plan and or pitching, how to work with folks when you're trying to launch a game, specifically on the PR side and or even marketing. We also really focus on carving out a network of peers and mentors for game makers. And oftentimes we kind of wrap all of that into some sort of like public exhibition and or showcase of personal projects. So a couple of ways that we do that, we have the Immersion program. It's kind of like a 2-week, think of it as a boot camp from start to finish. A lot of folks who kind of just jump in and are curious about learning more about games and what it all has to offer, you can do that with us in roughly 2 weeks. And by the end of it, you'll be able to have basically a game that you've made in 48 hours with this really awesome team of people. On the power leveling side, this is actually one of our 2 international programs. So power leveling really focuses on pairing guild leaders with guild members. So for example, we have a programming guild. We have 2 entrepreneurship guilds this year, all led by really incredible people, such as Jane Ung, who is the lead artist on Campo Santo, previously of Firewatch, and currently in the Valley of the Gods. And then, is this doing okay? Yeah. And then also Darren Horeb, who was the music director specifically for Supergiant, who is on Bastion, if folks are familiar with that, and Transistor, and also their most recent title, Pyre. So a lot of really, really incredible, knowledgeable people. And we pair teams, or we pair groups, essentially, guild leaders with guild members who have similar interests, and we send them off to GDC, which is the Game Developers Conference that's always hosted in San Francisco. And they experience the conference together. And really, that's the important part, is that you have kind of this small group of people that you're attending this conference with, and a mentor who can kind of guide you to share not only some tips, but also how they experience the space, and kind of what to look for. Grant workshops, we've realized that a lot of folks who are interested in making games themselves actually don't recognize that what kind of funds are available, and one of the biggest funding that we found that was really valuable was looking at grants, specifically artist grants that will fund projects. So we do a lot of grant workshops that actually help makers figure out what the best way and best approaches are to finding funding through grants, and we help review and such like that. We found that to actually be really helpful, and a good handful of folks have actually received some pretty large grants with our help, and that's been really exciting. And of course, we have kind of like our major festivals and game jam site. GlitchCon is a 2-day festival. It's a video game festival focused on experimental play, and also this kind of like intense conversations and series of speakers and presenters on various topics and games. GameCraft is our local game jam site where people get together every year. It's roughly around 200 to 300 people get together over a weekend and create a game together in 48 hours. And it's very possible for Valpo to have a site of their own, so you can just check that out next year. It's in January, and it's super fun. On the studio side, our studio primarily focuses on building really incredible games in collaboration with our network of partners. So the reason that this fits into our mission and why we do it is our approach to making games in the studio is really rooted in project-based and experiential learning. So here we are really looking for emerging game makers who can practice some of their technical skills and also communication skills, all while kind of like learning and doing problem solving to truly create something with a team and hit milestones along the way. It's much more intense and much more guided. And the reason that we even have this studio is so that we can make sure that roughly like 50% of the team is actually made up of emerging game makers, and our staff primarily oversees the development. It's been really wonderful, and we're kind of just going through the first 2 projects that we've taken on within. This is still relatively new, so we're pretty much starting the first 2 projects, and we're roughly around maybe like 3 months in on one of them and 4 months in on the other. So this has been really exciting for us, and also for the emerging game makers that have been working with us. So I think I've been talking quite a bit about, like, okay, we want to support emerging game makers. These are the things that we're doing. Here are, you know, all of the different programs that we do. I think the biggest question that even when I was writing all of this is why. Early on, when I had built an advisory board, a lot of folks had challenged me on the way that a lot of folks that were on our founding, or excuse me, our advisory board had challenged me and said, like, well, why aren't we doing programs and projects for folks who have been in the industry for like 10 years? They need support too. I was asked many different things, like, oh, what is your intended goal on this program? Why are we doing things this way, or why are we doing things that way? And I think over time, when folks have asked me that during our meetings, it's really helped to not only challenge some of the things that I've thought and or wanted to do, but also help me solidify what it is that my intentions and my goals are with games. I think one of the first things is I truly believe that digital games are the most exciting creative medium that we have today. They're technical, it's creative as well, and I think one of the most important things to note here is that it's active engagement. Games actively engage with their players. Unlike film and or music, there's actually a response from the player to the game. So you're not just listening to music, you're not passively watching a film. You are actively engaging with the material that's in front of you, and the decisions and the choices that you make are incredibly important. Or so we hope they are, if it's a good game. I truly believe that AAA development studios and publishers should invest in more experimental gameplay. What on earth does that mean? Each and every expansion to an existing IP actually takes less funding to build. So the initial Call of Duty took quite a bit of funding to actually create, but every single one after that never matched that initial funding. But it's still bringing in very similar revenue every single year. So what does that really mean? It means that a lot of AAA studios, AAA meaning the 3 A's are supposed to mean just larger development budgets and larger marketing budgets, and I don't really know what the third A is for. That's always what it means. But it really means that a lot of the AAA companies aren't truly pushing this medium forward because they don't need to, and financially they don't have to. It's just a fact of matter, and creating a new IP or testing something new out that might eventually actually not make its funding back is something that is a huge risk for lots of AAA companies. As we even just recently saw, Visceral Games just shut down, and they were working on a heavily narrative-driven Star Wars IP. And that was run by Amy Hennig, who is incredible and has been the creative director of all the Nathan Drake series and Uncharted. So I'd love to see more publishers and also developers invest in more experimental gameplay. I also believe that there should be some more diverse stories that are told through games. I think on average, I could actually bring up a lot of people have done this before actually, I could just bring up a giant grid of what games in AAA and their covers look like. There's also another one that you could actually probably look at on your mobile phones right now. If you take a phone out and look at your Apple store, you'll see that the majority of the games that are on the front page are, dudes yelling for some odd reason. That is something that has sold and sells very well. I'd love to see some other stories. I'd really love to see different types of stories from people that I don't really know, or from people who have just different perspectives than my own. I also believe that investing my time in helping others develop their voices will ultimately produce more games that I want to play. And I think that's really important. A little bit on the lessons that I've learned. And this will be my last slide before we kind of go into Q&A, because I believe that Q&A is like the best part of any presentation. So the first one is don't wait. If you're thinking about doing anything and you've always wanted to do it or you haven't tried it, just don't wait to do it. The time is really just now, and it's always possible to just learn by doing. One of the things that, as I've been working through my career and kind of trying to figure out is, well, what exactly is my trajectory? I realized at some point that it was okay to not define it and just start doing and letting the things and the choices that I make define themselves. That was so important to me, and I actually still continue to do that. I realize that I make certain choices based off of X, Y, or Z, and then I say yes to some of those things and I say no to others. And over time, I've figured out what my voice is. And that actually helps me in the future as well to figure out what I will say yes or no to. Make mistakes. Oh man, I can tell you all about the mistakes that I've made in 8 years, but one of the things that still haunts me today, and I've talked to a lot of the folks who were involved early on, is that when we started Glitch, specifically as a student group, I was 19. I was given $45,000, and I was told that I needed to get stuff done. I was going to say something else, but I needed to get things done. And I think at that time, like, who would imagine that at 19 you'd be in a leadership role? There were a lot of things that I had to learn just by doing, and also making a lot of those mistakes. There were things that I said that I wish I wouldn't have. There were things that I wish I would have known as to like how to handle conflict. There were definitely moments in which I felt like I could have been a better leader. And that's something that you just don't know unless you do. I can read all I want from Harvard Business School because they do a ton of things on leadership, and they have articles available everywhere. But until I'm put in that moment and with the people who are directly around me, and at that time too, and even now, my peers and my friends, those who I care about, you never know what's going to happen until it happens. So it's okay to make mistakes and also learn from them. And if there are things that you wish you could have done differently, reach out later and say, like, hey, I'm sorry that happened. It just happened and I did my best at the time, and reopen up those conversations. Or if you, the other thing, I'm mostly just talking about personal or interpersonal relationships right now, but there's a joke and a running tab amongst our staff with how much funding we've all lost within grants. We all know that every single person on our staff cares so much and so deeply about our goals and our mission, but sometimes things just happen. Whether you wrote down the wrong date for the grant or you just misremembered. I think at this point, the tab is myself, Nick, and Katie each have somewhere floating around like 90,000, and it's okay. But the number one thing is that we talked about it, and we trusted each other to know that we all wanted the best for the team, and it was just a mistake and we gotta move forward. Ask questions. man, one of the biggest things that I had learned pretty early on was just to be okay with being vulnerable and asking questions, especially when you didn't know something. One of the moments that I knew nothing at all was when we transitioned from having Glitch be a student group into a model where Glitch was becoming a social enterprise. I knew nothing about creating a nonprofit. I knew nothing about creating a B Corp. And I knew nothing about how that model even works. So there's a nonprofit that has 100% of the shares of a for-profit company. I knew I was really out of my element. And so my reaction to that was just to build an advisory board of people who supported me in the past and also, I believed, could support me in the future. So whether it was an attorney or someone on legal, or even folks who were my previous instructors who I really trusted and asked me some of those hard questions. I still have someone on our founding board today who knew nothing about games. She was a historian who loved barbarians and also had her law degree. But she always, every time when we talked, would ask me really tough questions. And that really stood out to me. Because those people are the ones that will challenge me and also help me think about things critically as we move forward with the organization. So, ask questions. This one took a long time to figure out. Finding happiness. At the end of the day, I really want to be able to be happy not only with my work life, but also my home life. And I realized really quickly that I tend to like to work a lot. And it's just, I think, a part of being an entrepreneur. You get really, really intensely invested in the project that you're doing, sometimes to even a fault. And I started recognizing that, I wasn't playing sports anymore. I wasn't even playing games very much anymore. There are things that I started to do because I was so interested in the work that I was doing that, my physical health and some of my mental health wasn't so great anymore. So we started just basically having a conversation about this in our office and saying, like, how do we restructure? How are some of the things that we're doing? How can we reallocate some of the things? Should we hire someone new? Should our board actually take on some of the responsibilities? Those were the things that I needed to do personally in order to feel like, I'm super happy in my role every day. And I wake up every single morning. This is something that I don't think very many people can say, but I get to work with some of my best friends. We get paid and compensated very well for our time. We're doing such amazing work that I don't even know if I would leave this if someone came by and was like, I'm going to give you, $500,000 annually to come work at this thing. Because right now we get to make the things that we want to make and do it with the people that we want to do it with. And that's incredible. Play games. Yep. Make sure to play games. And play different types of games. There are a lot of different games that are out there. And especially as we're even speaking right now, independent games have really made quite a bit of a leap, especially with the types of tools that are available with Unity and or Unreal, Game Maker. So making games is more accessible than ever, really. There's online tutorials everywhere teaching you how to actually create some of these games. And to be honest, a lot of the folks who are in this space are incredibly welcoming and nice. One of the first things that one of the first things that we had done was reach out to Mike Ambinder, who worked at Valve, and was like, hey, we're super into the things that you do. Could you come talk to us? And he was like, yeah, I would love to talk about my research. So playing games is super important. Just jump in and do it. A couple of ones that I would really recommend that have come out within the past couple of weeks. Florence is an iOS game. It's the game that you see on the top right-hand corner. They call it an interactive. What did they called it something on their website, and they didn't say game. And I have a tough time saying game as well, but it's a really great experience. And I would really recommend that folks just try it out. It's something that's a little different, very new, and something that I've never experienced before. It's very close to interactive fiction, and it's relatively short. It's like 30 minutes. Super good. I promise that it was a great game. Journey, if you haven't played Journey, it's getting old now, but man, that game was incredible. It was the first time that I had ever been able to be put into a game with another human and really care about them without ever having talked to them. I mean, you don't ever talk to that other person in game. You kind of just, move around. But that was such a radical experience for me. And the creative directors on both of these, Ken Wong, who's on Florence, who also previously was the lead game designer on Monument Valley, if folks are familiar with that. And Journey was created by Genova Chen, who is incredible and has done a ton of research on the concept of flow and the theory of flow. Was the lead on Journey. And the last one is Stardew Valley. So if you're feeling, this game really hit home with me recently because I'm super busy, and I hate saying that, but my schedule is legitimately very busy, and my calendar looks insane, and it looks more insane as soon as I add everyone else's on our staff, and also our conference room and our event schedule. But this game kind of perfectly fit into my hectic life schedule. And I even saw myself kind of changing from the ways that I was playing games. I really, really cared so much about competitive games like StarCraft and really competitive strategy games, League of Legends, etc. into this person who really likes these shorter experiences. Stardew Valley really fit that for me, and it's a farming simulator. How many of you are familiar with it? Okay, cool. So I'll still talk about it because there was about half. It's a farming simulator where you just inherited a farm from your grandpa who passed away. My farm is called the Cheese Farm, and you can just kind of hang out there. You can go fishing. You can grow crops. You can go into the mines and try to battle and find various items and resources. Or you can choose to romance some people in the town. That's cool too. But the way that it's set up, each day is roughly around 15 or so minutes. So I wake up at 6 in the morning, and then I have to go to bed by midnight. But it's roughly about a 15-minute day, and I can get a lot done on this cheese farm in 15 minutes, and it's awesome. Lastly, make games. So if you've ever been curious, and I'm sure many of you are as you're sitting here, as I mentioned earlier, there are tons and tons and tons of resources now that are available. So if you're super into programming and need some art, there's a ton of free assets on the asset store for Unity if you are just specifically starting out and wanting to try things out. Don't use those in your real games that you publish, of course, but all of those assets are free, and you can just jump in and make something pretty quickly, especially if you know the C languages. What's used in Unity is C#. And if you're an artist who doesn't quite know very much about programming, or even if you're a narrative designer or something of sorts, you can always start off with things like Game Maker, or even a bit more simple than that, kind of like a drag and drop, is Construct. I think it's on Construct 3 now, but it's actually pretty cool. And you can make things relatively fast. Just get it up and running, and see if you're having fun. Yeah, try it out. And that's going to be it for my presentation, and I'm open to Q&A now. Yes?
Do you have any advice for someone who's been making games for many years now but has never been able to figure out how to publish?
Oh, you haven't been able to figure. What's the block for you in publishing?
Legal issues.
Legal
I
issues.
could just fill out the form, but then I click an asterisk, like, what does this form mean? And like, oh, I'm supposed to have like a certain type of address and a certain type
Sure.
of, you know.
There's actually a website out there. I have to dig really quick, but there is actually a website that'll walk you through that. So really all it is, though, is that you do have to have an LLC or a sole proprietorship, so you could just enter in your own social security number. But I'm assuming you're talking about Steam, right?
Steam or even the Google Play Store will.
Okay. Yeah. So the easiest thing that you could do is register for an LLC. It takes not very long online. I think you can actually create a business in like 10 minutes.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, and then you'll have all the information that you need. But I believe the last thing is you will have to have a bank account that it's associated with. And so you can use your own personal one and call it a sole proprietorship, or you can just create a new bank account just so that that's always tied with that account and or company that you made. And hopefully that should be it. I know it sounds really scary initially, but I think you could actually manage to get that out and hit publish by the end of the day if you spent a day on it.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
What's your favorite type of game? Like platform, RPG, story?
Oh man, I think I don't know anymore. Like I said, I used to be so hardcore, where I cared so much about strategy games, and I was so interested in like the initial StarCraft, and I watched all of the pro Korean games that were on Star League, and then I started kind of getting a little bit more into like action RPGs, played a lot of way too much of Diablo, specifically Diablo 2 and Diablo 3. I played mostly at the time on Diablo 3. I played the auction house, but not really the game. And then I think as I'm adulting, I'm not even that old, I'm 28. But as I'm adulting, I'm starting to really get into things that are lower pressure, right? So there's not an intense need to feel like I need to challenge myself and win. And more so, I'm starting to see myself kind of like go towards the games like, you know, a farming simulator, and or Florence that I can play and drag and drop things in, 30 minutes and I can finish a game. So things that I can do, I don't think it's a genre specific. I don't think it's genre specific at all, but just things that I can do in roughly 30 minutes or less that is enjoyable and relaxing and doesn't make me feel, intense anger or intense stress about the world, and that's kind of where I've landed. So that's kind of like my gamer journey for you for now. But yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned Stardew Valley, since it's interesting in the fact that it was made by one guy actually.
Yeah, over 4 years. It's
Eric
crazy.
Brown, yeah. What would you say to maybe someone interested in game development? Would you say, if you want to try the lone wolf method, or would you advise against that?
I have lots of thoughts. Can I ask you follow-up questions? What is your goal, or what is the goal in mind here?
Personally?
Yeah, sure.
To create a story.
Yeah. What is that story, and then what is kind of like the scope of this game that you have in mind?
I actually don't have one in mind. I'm just interested in it.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
work too hard at it, but
Okay.
I've always wondered, should I look for a team or should I try it myself?
Sure. So I think the answer comes down to what is your preference. I don't think I'd do Glitch without a team. I know developers that wouldn't do Stardew Valley with a team. So I think it comes down to personal preference, but as I even just mentioned, Stardew Valley took 4 years. Toby Fox on, why can't I think right now, Undertale. I think Undertale took 3 years. You essentially extend your development time the more that you take on, right? And I think depending on what your goals are, like, do you want to be known as like the solo developer? Do you want to, you know, work with a team because it's something that sounds fun to you? I think it really depends on the goals and also some of the scenarios, like in which are you currently employed? Yeah, like right, there are so many scenarios. Like, are you currently employed? Is this like your full-time thing? Is this everyone else's full-time thing? Yeah, so like, I think the question comes down to like, what are your personal goals, and kind of thinking about how development will fit into that. Like I said, I don't think I'd make games myself. Like I actually, I enjoy being able to collaborate and work with others because there are just those beautiful, beautiful moments where you're just sitting around and making jokes about things and then it gets incorporated into the game. Yeah, those are the moments that I like personally live for, is like that human interaction. But I see a lot of developers, you know, being able to be awesome and go it alone, and they're like hyper focused on this one thing and only this one thing for X amount of time. So sorry that that's not like a very straightforward answer, but yeah, it has to be based on an individual, their time scope, circumstances. Yeah.
One thing you said you were interested in is AAA developers taking risks.
Yeah.
Are there any examples in recent memory you can think of like a AAA developer that took a risk and it ended up very successful?
Sure.
Or like on the flip side, one that didn't go as well?
Yeah, so taking risks. So I guess the easy ones are technically Destiny was kind of a big risk, right? It's not an average shooter, but it's still a shooter. It's a little quirky, it's a little different, and it also is a brand new IP. So it's not something that was, you know, existed over 10 years. And I think that's gone over very well. I think also in the opposite end, what I mentioned earlier too was with Visceral, like narrative-driven games that are, you know, hundreds of hours, that will take hundreds of hours to complete, are kind of risky right now, because as I even just said, like, I'm looking for 30-minute experiences that aren't taxing on me and my mind, and I'm looking for kind of like a chill moment, and I'm not looking to sink my teeth into like hundreds of hours. I think in like this day and age, those games are actually relatively risky to still continue to make, and that's why you're seeing less and less of them, and you're seeing way more multiplayer. You're seeing very, very short rounds of games, so you can play like an Overwatch match in under 20 minutes mostly. So that and Visceral closing is something that signifies that there was kind of some risk that was taken and it didn't pan out. Other questions? I'm a super open book. We can chat about anything.
What's the biggest games that you've worked on, that kind of stuff?
Sure. So I think like the biggest clearly would be League of Legends. And then the other ones that are currently in development, they're not out yet. So I have no clue the follow-up to all of that, because all of the other games were primarily like independent for funsies, since the majority of my work has been to support game makers. And the studio, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is relatively new. So I would have to say primarily League of Legends, and the follow-up to that is TBD.
What all game engines do you work on?
What?
What all the game engines on which you make games in your company?
As in like platforms?
Yeah, no,
Sure.
game engines like Unity, Unreal, Game
Oh,
Maker.
engines, sure. We pretty much exclusively use Unity.
Okay.
It's just there's significantly more support on Unity. There's a very large community that is around Unity. So if there are ever any issues, etc., their tools are really nice too. So for porting, when you're thinking about doing anything that's related to any sort of consoles, just their porting features are really nice. The fact that they have Unity Analytics as like a native feature is great. So all we have to do is just put in like a couple lines of code, hook it in the game, and then be done. And then it'll collect all of the raw data and give it to us in like a JSON export. So like that's really nice. Unreal is fine. I think there are many games in which Unreal would be like the choice engine. But engines are kind of just engines, so it depends on you and your team and your comfort. And fortunately, our developers are very, very well versed in Unity, and were some of the first Unity developers when they actually launched Unity back in like 2006 or 2007. So folks within our team have been with Unity for a very, very, very long time.
You work on 2D as well as 3D, right?
Yep. Yeah.
So what is your response to the debate on some type of video games making a certain type of people like aggressive, and how does that like kind of translate to how games can be used to benefit somebody, or like you said earlier, kind of give people different perspectives?
Sure. I have lots of thoughts on this too. But there are lots of papers that suggest that games can promote aggressive behavior. I don't personally believe that. And there isn't a ton, like even though those papers are out there, they're not very well replicated. In addition to, that's just that. Like they're just not very well replicated. So I would say that the science on that is meh at best. But that being said, I think a lot of popular media has picked it up, and that's like a thing that we hear all of the time. It was more rampant on a lot of online news sources for like maybe a couple of years ago even. But I wouldn't worry too much about that until there's like more evidence that suggests that. On the impact side, there's quite a bit of information out there on learning specifically. And there's a whole group of peoples that study learning and development within games. That has all looked overall pretty promising. And if folks are interested, I'm more than happy to send over papers. But overall, that's looking pretty promising. The toughest part about the learning aspects right now is that a lot of the games that are out there that are commercially successful don't actually have any sort of research team that's working on them. There are no papers that are covering them. There's not much evidence for the learning because there isn't research, not only internally, but also on like a wider level. Academics aren't really like studying Overwatch intensely.
Not yet.
Not yet, I
Not
guess.
officially.
Yeah, not officially, right?
It's like,
So it's one of those things where there are almost no games out there that have evidence that can suggest that playing X game equals Y outcomes. And that's just the fact of matter of things. So as for like the impact side, it's all very wishy-washy right now, and I wish it weren't. So follow along with Games for Change if that's something that you're interested in. Games for Change is an international nonprofit, and they have a festival every year in New York City that focuses on games that are being used for social impact. And that's where I think like the most up-to-date content would be with some of the leaders in that space would be able to talk about it. And they also typically will post their talks online. Yeah.
So I'll throw in a little bit of a sort of a nugget. It's not quite the same idea, but there certainly have been some games that have been crowdsourcing problem solving from the science perspective too. So where they're doing like trying to find molecule layouts that work and things
Sure,
like that.
Fold It.
Yeah, Fold It.
Yes.
Is like an example of that. So there are some games out there that do, it's not a learning side, but it's also,
Yeah.
it is a social impact side from the flip
Yeah.
side.
So for those who are unfamiliar, you can look up the project called Fold It. Basically, there was a game that was made about folding proteins, and there were some pretty significant breakthroughs that the people who were playing that game were actually able to figure out just by playing a game and having the same rules as like the human body does with folding proteins. And yes, it was really cool. And some of what the players of that game were able to complete and create actually amounted to many, like tens of years of actual research from researchers and institutions. So that's definitely an example and a really good one too. Yeah, any other questions? Yeah.
Do you offer any internships for graduates or something?
Sure. The answer is yes-ish. We've actually been testing out like fellowships, and we haven't announced that yet, but we will be soon. This upcoming summer already have 5 fellows that are lined up to work on various projects. And so the answer essentially is yes, we just don't have anything that's formalized that you can see yet on the website. Any other final questions? Okay. Well, with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Thais.
Everyone, thank you for being here. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your attention. Go out into this cold night and join me one more time in thanking Evva Kraikul.